Right. Tomorrow, When the War Began by John Marsden. John Marsden is an Australian author. He's been writing since the 80s. He writes very, very well. This particular book came out in 93. It's the first in the Tomorrow series. I think there's 7 or maybe 8 in the Tomorrow series. And it is a really thrilling read. Now, I picked up this book and a couple others from the series recently when a second-hand shop was having a 10 for $1 sale. I thought it was a good chance to reread. I have read this book before, and I've seen the movie, which came out in, I'm gonna say 2010. I could be wrong about that. It was a great movie, but the books are brilliant. Now, I remembered it as being a good book. I never kept going with the series after I finished this first one, but I enjoyed the book. It was well written, it had excellent characters, and I thought I'd come back to it. It is probably one that's familiar to most Australian people who were reading in the 90s and early noughties. It is certainly going to be familiar to a lot of New South Wales and Victorian young people because this book is on the curriculum, on the reading curriculums for the schools there. But for those Australians those who aren't Australian and aren't familiar with it, it's a futuristic scenario. We start off in a tiny fictional town of Werribee. Is it Werribee? They call it. I think it's Werribee. Werribee, that's it, Werribee. Werribee is a fictional, but it's only a 1-letter difference from a real town in Australia. And the fictional bay that is in the book series is also quite similar to a fictional bay that's also in Victoria. A lot of the topography which he describes is from actual places, in some cases the Blue Mountains, and the flora and fauna and topography are very, very Australian. Now, in the first part of the book, he establishes the main character, Ellie. That's a girl, by the way, for those who aren't familiar with Australian shortenings. And her friends. So Ellie and Corinne are sitting around. It's holidays, and they're teenagers. I think they're about 15 or 16, thereabouts. And they decide to go on a camping trip. They're going to go a bit further than they've ever gone before, up to the ridge where they believe they can climb into a gorge that no one they know has actually gone into, but there's a rumour that a hermit used to live there. So they collect a group of 7 friends. Corinne's boyfriend, Ellie's neighbour, Homer, who she's grown up around and thinks of almost like a brother, and a few other people. And they head up on this camping trip. So they climb down to this gorge that's never been climbed into before. And all of this section is just setting the scene, and it does it so well. It's strong on Australian flavour, strong enough that if you haven't read much Australian fiction, you may struggle a couple of times. But it doesn't do ochre, and it's not waving Australian around at you. It's just setting the scene, and it does that beautifully. It's actually a very exciting book. It's one of the more thrilling and suspenseful books that I've read recently. And it's still considered a young adult because the characters are all teenagers, but it beats a lot of adult books into the ground in terms of the writings and the characterization. Now, they've gone to camp there for a week, and they find their way down to the bottom of the gorge. They set up camp. They have a great weekend lounging around, doing what teenagers do, which is not much in holidays. And one night, Ellie wakes up in the middle of the night, and it's cold, and she needs to go pee. So she gets up, finds a tree, comes back, and there's an awful lot of planes going overhead. And for a second, it worries her. But then she thinks, oh yeah, they're just coming back from Commemoration Day, which is also the show day, which all their friends and family are going to be at if they're not at the camping trip. So they think nothing more of it, and a couple of days later, when they emerge from the gorge, something is wrong. Ellie's parents aren't there. Most of the livestock is dead. This is a very rural base. There's a town, but it's a small town. And the teenagers consist of half rural and a couple of urban kids whose parents are white-collar workers, solicitors, and so forth in town. But there's a lot of rural. So in many ways, I think this makes a lot more sense than other books where you've got a whole heap of teenagers who suddenly turn themselves into a guerrilla force or survive all the odds. Rural kids have got a lot of skills that you don't really think of until you need them. And I think this makes this much more believable than several other young adult style books in which people do things that are outside their scope. So they've emerged. Ellie's parents aren't there. The livestock are dead or dying. Something's wrong. They one by one they go to all the houses of the parents of the kids. Again, there's no one there, and slowly they discover that Australia has been invaded. Now, who exactly has invaded us is never made clear. It is made clear that it's an Asian country, but this isn't meant to be a commentary on countries, maybe a little bit on regional policy, but not a whole lot. Anyway, been invaded by a force, and they manage to stay clear of being captured. They get supplies, they go back to the gorge. Slowly but surely they try and discover what has happened, where their parents are, what's gone wrong. They eventually manage to get a shortwave radio and find out that yes, Australia has been invaded, and that most of the rest of the world is doing nothing about it. In 1993, policies were different, and I think that's actually reasonably believable for 1993. Let's hope that the politicians have done something since then, and it's less believable now, because you never know. Anyway, it's an exciting book. This was I have to keep on reading. I can't go to bed. I have to know what happens next type book. And okay, a little bit spoilery. Eventually, they decide they've got to fight back in some way, and the culmination of this book is where they blow up a bridge, which is what they think is a major supply route. They don't think that their particular town is a target for any reason, but they think it's been taken over so completely because of the bay which is near it and which is being used to land supplies for the invasion of Australia. There's so much that is good about this book. The characters are believable. It talks about many issues that are relevant to the 90s and still relevant now, and it talks about them in non-stereotypical ways. So for example, Ellie's best friend and neighbour Homer comes from a Greek family, and the differences in that are explored but never in a stereotypical way. Another boy on the team is Lee. His parents are Vietnamese and Thai. Again, it explores some of the issues of Asians trying to blend into rural towns. And it does it, I think, realistically. Some towns are better than others, obviously. Some places are more racist than others. But the fact that you've got a good mix of different people and different backgrounds here makes for a really rich reading experience. Each one of these seems real. There's a whole heap of interesting personal themes as well, because they've found out that their families are all captive in the showgrounds, and they are worried about their families, they want to do something, but they're realistic enough to realize that if they try to do anything about their families being captive, basically it's going to mean themselves being killed or taken captive themselves. So you've got a lot of personal dilemmas that are worked out at a deep emotional but heavily realistic basis, and I really like that. It's a lot of young adult can be superficial, and there's nothing superficial about most of the themes in this book. Later on, there's an incident where a group of three of them trying to escape soldiers in the town. They blow up Moa, and they run away as they hear screams of these soldiers, and they have to deal with the fact that they probably killed people. These are teenagers. They don't particularly feel murderous. Most of them don't feel particularly murderous, but they probably have killed people in self-defense in a way, so they have to work through all of that. And again, it's incredibly well done. So the writing is beautiful. I thoroughly recommend this book. 1993 to now has not dated hardly at all. Now, the only way in which this whole theme and this whole storyline has dated from 1993 to 2023 is the absence of mobile phones. In the early 90s, mobile phones were on the horizon, but they weren't there yet. And a lot of this plot couldn't really be made realistic without explaining away mobile phones, because what basically happened is most of the population of Wirrawee was in the showgrounds for the show day, which is a big thing in most towns in Australia, but in rural communities even more so. And basically they were enclosed well in the show and taken captive all at once. Things like that are less easy to explain in the era of mobile phones, so you would need to do a little bit of explaining. Anyway, it's a great book, it's fun reading, it's very mature in many ways, and it's exciting. It is actually thrilling to read. So, I do thoroughly recommend it. It's speculative fiction, future fiction, not really science fiction, there's not a lot of science there, so it's speculative. And it hasn't dated poorly, and it's so thrilling. I'm going straight on to the next one. I've got no compunction, the writing will see me through, even if I haven't actually read the second one yet, and I'm comparing it against this first one, which is so damn good. Anyway, thoroughly recommend, especially if you're into Australiana.